Vili is Professor of Economic Sociology and Digital Social Research at the University of Oxford. And he leads a research group examining the politics and socio-economic implications of digital technologies. His current research examines the geopolitics of digital infrastructures. And he has several books. One has a similar title as his talk today, Cloud Empires, How Digital Platforms Are Overtaking the State and How We Can Regain Control. And previously, he wrote a book called Virtual Economies, Design and Analysis, published by MIT Press. And I hear that Vili will be presenting to us a paper that is currently under review and is kind of a follow-up on his book. So he will be presenting that paper for about half an hour, and then I'm delighted to take your questions. Should you have any questions, you can already type them in the chat if you like. And afterwards, of course, I'm also going to take your questions by raising your virtual hand. On that note, Vili, we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Danny. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. It's a privilege to kick off this excellent seminar series for the spring. As Danny mentioned, this is a sort of a continuation or a building on my book. My book focused on the power of big tech companies on the level of platforms and marketplaces, and telling the sort of history of the institutional transformation of the digital economy from 1990s up to the present day, and asking why did the internet end up being controlled by a small number of gatekeepers, even though in the 90s, if you remember, the internet was supposed to create the very opposite of that. It was supposed to get rid of gatekeepers and disintermediate middlemen and so on. We ended up with the very opposite. And the book is kind of story of that on the level of, if you think in terms of a stack, on the level of the marketplaces and platforms, the application layer. And then now in my current work, I'm focusing on more the infrastructural layer, the actual physical layer underpinning the digital world. And so the paper that I'm basing this talk today on is titled Cloud Empire's Physical Footprint, How Trade and Security Politics Shape the Global Expansion of US and Chinese Data Center Infrastructures. And this paper is currently in review, as Danny mentioned, at the Review of International Political Economy. So I'm very keen to hear any comments you may have so that we can take the feedback into account. And the paper is available as a working paper version on SSRN if you like to search for it. And basically the starting point and motivation for this paper in many ways was the observation that there's a kind of invisible revolution going on the infrastructural layer of the digital world, where computation is moving from on-premises small data centers and corporate server rooms into ever larger cloud infrastructures, private cloud infrastructures, but especially public cloud infrastructures. And cloud, of course, is a bit of a misnomer in the sense that it's not like that means the computation and data are moving into some sort of a distributed ephemeral actual cloud, but rather that it's moving into very large data centers that look, let me see if I can actually manage to change the slide, look something like this Microsoft data center in the Netherlands. Well, I'm sort of calling this tentatively the reverse personal computing revolution, Because if you remember, the whole thing about the personal computing revolution in the 80s was that computation spread out from inside data centers hosting mainframes into across society. Every organization, even every individual worker got their own computer and started performing computation and storing data on their own devices. And that had tremendous political implications as well as implications to innovation. It enabled small teams in the proverbial garage to start doing high technology product development. And now we're seeing a sort of a reversal of that, where computation is moving back inside these huge data centers under the rubric of cloud computing. And I'm wondering about the political and economic implications of the shift. So if it's the case that computation is indeed moving back inside closed doors like this, and I can give some examples of this, like in the UK government has a so-called cloud first policy. I discovered through a freedom of information request that the tax authority is entirely based on Amazon Web Services now. Some of the leading banks are. And even according to some media reports, even the spy agencies, MI5, MI6, GCHQ, they store their classified secret information on Amazon Web Services. So even the public sector in some countries, in very concrete ways, is becoming very dependent on cloud, and specifically so-called public cloud, which means these shared cloud infrastructures. And so I suppose the first question that comes to mind is, well, where is this cloud in practice then? Where are these data centers? And so what we did was we mapped the availability, so-called availability zones belonging to so-called regions of the 6 largest public cloud providers. And the blue dots on this map, they represent US cloud providers' availability zones, and the red dots represent Chinese providers. And obviously, one of the most striking things about this is that in this map, we literally only have US and Chinese providers. You might ask, well, where are the European providers, for instance? European providers, OVH, Hetzner, Upcloud, they're quite strong in the so-called private cloud market. But the public cloud market, which is about 10 times bigger and which is growing much more rapidly, is basically dominated by US and Chinese players. There are a few more companies than what we've chosen to include here, but these are the main ones. And besides, well, then we could analyze, well, where in the world are they? You can see there's a bit of a global south, global north thing going on there, which may have all kinds of implications if data processing essentially happens in North America, Europe, and China, but the vast majority of the world's population is actually not in these places. But in this paper, what we instead focused on was this interesting idea that if you look, there's about 500, and I forget the exact number, but close to 600 of these so-called availability zones spread around the world, belonging to these 6 top providers. And about half of those availability zones are located in the US and in China. But if we then look at that third countries in the context of this sort of US-China techno-geopolitical rivalry, the third countries, that is to say every other country, and then you look at the ratio of US versus Chinese infrastructure in a given third country, you can calculate what we call the cloud infrastructure alignment of a given country. So for instance, Germany is about 65% 65% US infrastructure, and about 36% Chinese infrastructure. Why would you care about the cloud infrastructure alignment of a country? Well, Farrell and Newman's book, The Underground Empire, as well as their long line of research that they've performed, talks about so-called weaponized interdependence, the idea that technological infrastructures can be weaponized by the countries that host, that are the home countries of the technology companies that provide it. They refer to the so-called choke point effect, which means that if you are entirely reliant on infrastructure from a given country, then that country, that superpower, may choose to cut off your access to the infrastructure as a means of coercion. They also refer to the so-called panopticon effect, which means essentially spying, using infrastructure for spying. And then we can debate to what extent is this an actual risk in the case of cloud infrastructure, and to what extent, can it be managed by, for instance, encrypting the data and so on. But it remains the case that the actual physical location of digital infrastructure and who owns it is becoming and has become a matter of great geopolitical interest for governments. So this is why it's worth looking into this. So then if we try to understand, well, why, what explains a given country's cloud infrastructure alignment, we basically went through the literature on technology and geopolitics and extracted three sort of stylized narratives or almost like hypotheses from it. The first one is a sort of business as usual hypothesis, that cloud business is like any business shaped by market opportunities, by supply and demand. It's an export business for the US, it's an export business for China, and their companies go to whichever markets offer the greatest potential for returns. And we know from economic geography that countries tend to export to those countries that are geographically closer to them, that are larger markets, that share language or culture. There's a number of different factors that explain why a given country exports to another country. But the point is that exports are largely correlated. And so if the business as usual hypothesis is true, then we would expect that basically US cloud infrastructure is used in those countries that in general buy a lot of things from the US. Chinese cloud infrastructure is used in those countries that in general buy a lot of things from China. So these things should be correlated. Now, of course, trade relations are also shaped by things like security relations, but cloud infrastructure shouldn't be any different from any other export industry in that sense. But then there's a starkly different narrative or hypothesis in the literature, which basically says that because cloud infrastructure and digital infrastructure in general gives this sort of infrastructural power to those superpowers that control it, for that reason, they in fact try to, by means of government policy, try to extend it intentionally to those countries over which they wish to exert influence. So that sort of digital infrastructure as an extension of imperialism, of kind of politics of domination, of geopolitical domination. And if that's the case, you know, I might actually take a step back there and say, if we, you know, look from Farrell and Newman perspective, essentially what they claim is that where originally the US sort of stumbled into having this empire, they didn't intentionally build that global network that can be weaponized for coercion and spying, but that was built by sort of commercial forces, and then they eventually sort of realized, oh, this could be used for security and sort of military purposes. And then China realized the same. So China started building, according to this narrative, intentionally by means of government policy, pushing out technological infrastructures. And then both superpowers attempting to contain each other's expansion, and same sort of in a Cold War style containment. And an example of this is the US asking its allies to stop using Huawei equipment. And if this is the case, then in terms of kind of how to operationalize that, we'd expect the cloud alignment of a given third country to be, on the one hand, positively correlated perhaps with security cooperation, because we would expect these superpowers to have greater influence over their existing security alliance members. But we might also expect cloud infrastructure alignment to be positively correlated with militarized interstate conflict. And why is this? It's because if we think of infrastructure expansion as an extension of other means of domination and coercion, then that includes military coercion. An example of this would be China and Philippines. So China and Philippines are locked in conflict in the South China Sea over maritime territory. Coast Guard vessels and such constantly clashing around certain islands. At the same time, the Chinese government supported Alibaba's efforts to build a data center in Manila, the first hyperscale cloud data center in the country. So you could see this as an example of sort of using, potentially could interpret it as an example of the expansion of digital infrastructures to a third country as a means of gaining additional influence or leverage over them. But then there's a third narrative or hypothesis which emphasizes third country agency, the idea that, well, actually, third countries have a choice here. They don't just passively receive infrastructures from expansionary superpowers, but in fact, they choose infrastructures on the basis of their own national and economic security needs. So an example of this would be Taiwan, which, even though it does much more trade with China than with the US, nevertheless, it only has US hyperscale cloud infrastructure in the country, not Chinese. If this is the case, if this hypothesis holds true, then we'd expect cloud infrastructure alignment to be positively correlated with security cooperation ties, alliance memberships, and so on, but negatively correlated with conflict. So third countries would avoid infrastructure from countries that they are engaged in militarized interstate disputes with. So then we went on. Basically, this literature is mostly qualitative, and it's more, I would say this whole literature is very much sort of qualitative and based on discussing particular countries and cases and case studies. So what we're offering to this discussion is the first quantitative study with all the advantages and disadvantages that come with that. So we basically, our own data set, our original data set is a data set that describes the number of US cloud infrastructure availability zones per country, number of Chinese availability zones per country, and then we can calculate this cloud alignment variable from them. And then we use standard variables and data sets used in studies of international trade and international relations for trade. So there's IMF direction of trade statistics. The cooperation is based on NATO memberships and major non-NATO ally status and Shanghai Cooperation Association memberships. Conflict that is based on the militarized interstate dispute database. And then we fit this logistic regression model on the data in which we try to explain the country's cloud infrastructure alignment. That is the ratio of US to Chinese availability zones as a combination of these trade and security related variables that I mentioned. We estimate a number of models, and for certain reasons, I'd like to focus your attention to model 3, in which the positive coefficient means that a country that a particular that the coefficient in question, the variable in question is positively really associated with cloud infrastructure alignment and vice versa. And basically what the results suggest is that imports from a given superpower, so imports from US or imports from China, are strongly correlated with cloud infrastructure alignment towards that superpower, which makes sense. So if you're importing goods from US, you're also importing cloud services, fair enough, and vice versa. Exports to US and China, not so much. Fine, that also sort of accords with theory. There's no theoretical reason to expect that exports to US would generate use of US cloud, or there might be some support for that too. But anyway, we don't really detect much support for that. Then for security cooperation, so if you're a member of NATO or you're a designated major non-NATO ally, like Saudi Arabia or Philippines, then you are there's some evidence to suggest that you're slightly more likely to use US infrastructure. And also if you're a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Association, perhaps you're slightly more likely to use Chinese or to have Chinese infrastructure in your country. But the evidence is pretty weak for that, quite surprisingly. Because we have several NATO countries, the small NATO countries, Norway, Finland, Sweden, soon to be NATO, that, or did they already manage to join? I guess they just joined, that only have American infrastructure. But then we have, for instance, Turkey, another NATO member that only has Chinese cloud infrastructure. Saudi Arabia, major non-NATO ally, the same thing. So security cooperation membership in this kind of alliances doesn't really explain it very well. So this kind of an idea that the world is dividing into two techno-geopolitical blocks that use mutually incompatible technological stacks, that's not really supported by this analysis. But instead, we find quite a strong negative association between militarized interstate conflict and the adoption of cloud infrastructure in the US or China. So those countries that have, within the past 30 years, we set a certain cutoff, experienced militarized interstate border disputes, whatever this sort, with the US are significantly less likely to adopt US infrastructure, same for China. And so to us, that sort of suggests that, well, first of all, hyperscale cloud infrastructures are shaped by both trade and security politics, it seems. Okay, that was sort of expected. But I would emphasize that this is on top, the effect of security politics here, due to the way we model this, is on top of the effect that security politics already have on trade in general, right? So alliance memberships, militarized interstate disputes, they already have an effect on trade. You're less likely to trade with a country that you're in dispute with. But on top of that, cloud infrastructure, we can see an additional effect. So it seems to be particularly sensitive to militarized interstate disputes. But then in terms of what kind of security politics, we do see this quantitative overview of all the countries that have this infrastructure, that there seems to be more evidence for what we call the third country strategic choice than for digital imperialism. This is because it appears that the third countries are successfully they're picking infrastructure from the direction which they're not involved in dispute with. And if it's the case that these digital superpowers are trying to use cloud infrastructure expansion as an extension of other means of exerting influence over third countries, including military influence in the case of the various South China Sea conflicts that China has, if they are indeed trying to push infrastructure, then it appears that third countries are have been quite successful in resisting that by various policy levers available to them, such as licensing for data centers, subsidies for particular data center providers, and certification schemes and so on. So Philippines stands perhaps as a counter example to this, but the trend seems to be that there isn't a great sort of war by other means, war by digital means going on, at least according to this analysis. But as a final point, of course, the results don't in any way negate the idea. In fact, they support the idea that the most effective means for digital superpowers to expand their infrastructures may actually be so-called geo-economic tools to shape the terms of trade on which the sort of commercial rationale of expansion depends on. And what do I mean by that? For instance, when negotiating the Indo-Pacific partnership, Biden was going around countries in the region, and Biden and his cabinet lobbying for data protection legislation that would be supportive of US companies' way of doing business rather than European style privacy rules or Chinese style system. Similarly, China, through Belt and Road Initiative and the Digital Belt and Road Initiative, is attempting to shape terms of trade, not just offering subsidies and offering political support and protection for expansion of these companies, but also attempting to negotiate trade agreements that favor the expansion of their particular flavor of cloud infrastructure. And as a final point then, well, I guess it's not really a final point then if I already made a final, but second final point, then people usually ask at this point, well, how about the third alternative? Why is it so concentrated to US and China? And this is something I have a lot to say on, but just to say something briefly, I believe and I've come to conclusion that it has to do a lot with scale economies. So what we're seeing is a sort of industrialization of computation. If so far we've lived in an era of sort of cottage industry computing, where every individual and every company generates their own compute and data storage on premises, just like pre-industrialization era manufacturing in Europe. Now we're seeing the move towards these very large facilities, which bring huge efficiencies in terms of operational efficiencies, but also energy efficiency. So also the need to reduce the environmental footprint of the digital world may be driving this shift towards hyperscale computation. And because of the first mover advantage, because of the large home markets, because of the global scale of their infrastructure, these hyperscalers are able to have been very successful. And then just to show that basically the capital investment by these hyperscalers is in a year is on the same level of individual sort of nation states' entire R&D budget. So it's not necessarily feasible for Europe, for instance, to start competing head on with hyperscalers in terms of trying to build national clouds or sovereign clouds via public sector funds alone, which is currently something that is sort of suggested. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much for your attention.